looks like.
Goes all the way back.
Yeah. There's a big old lipstick mark right on the microphone.
Or they go left.
I don't know. Lead in very in. Are we just waiting on Axel?
Yes, or we start and he shows up whenever he shows up.
Yeah. No, this is.
Thanks. Just because
Yeah.
it's weird on camera.
Should we get started or wait for?
I mean, why not?
All right. Yeah, sure. Is this on? Oh, okay. Hi, everybody. I think we're just going to get started since we're a little over already. My name is Meg Downey. I am a comic book journalist and historian with CBR.com, and we are here today to talk about Jack Kirby. So a born and bred New Yorker from the Lower East Side, Jack Kirby's legacy in the Marvel Universe can be seen in its setting as much as it can be found in its characters. From the Baxter Building to Yancy Street, Kirby's experience with the city around him informed and poured the foundation for the sprawling shared universe that we know as a touchstone of the Marvel Universe today. So I'm here with, down in the end, Greg Young of the Bowery Boys podcast. It's a New York
Hello.
history podcast. Marvel executive editor Tom Brevoort. And Brandon Montclair, from the writer of Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur. And we are going to be talking about Jack's legacy in New York City, specifically in the Marvel Universe. So to start, I thought we would throw it to Greg and have him inform us a little bit about what the Lower East Side in New York City might have looked like during Jack's childhood in the 20s and 30s.
Thank you. Just to even go back, just to bore you by going back even a little further with the whole idea of how comic books are as New York as you can possibly get in terms of creations. They're as New York as a bagel. I mean, other places make bagels, but they're just not as good. So, but the whole industry was born here and then was fostered here by all of this great talent. And it really wasn't. I mean, you had a few companies here that did produce them in the mid-century outside of New York, but for the most part, the entire industry was here in New York City. So essentially, the comic book was invented as a sort of an extension of the comic strip, which was basically created out of a newspaper rivalry during the Gilded Age. But in the 1920s, you had these major comic strips that were already being licensed into films and everything. All the major marketing opportunities that we see now really started all the way back then with Annie, Popeye, for instance. By the 30s, someone had the great idea of taking that Sunday supplement and taking it out of the newspaper and just selling it, but it was still full of a bunch of comic strips. Then someone else had a great idea the year later to say, well, why don't we have to just use comic strips? Why don't we just use original material? So then within 2 or 3 years, you had several of the major players and several of the major characters that were invented by that time. So let's go back to the year 1917. This is when Jack Kirby was born in the Lower East Side, specifically on Essex Street is where he was born, though he grew up on Suffolk Street, so which are all very close to each other. And I mean, today it's like artisanal restaurants and faux punk bars down there, and so it doesn't really, but if you look really hard, you can still see the Lower East Side that he grew up in, which was, largely an immigrant population, mostly Jewish. Most of these people came from, by this time, by the 1910s, most of these people were from Russia, Eastern Europe. There were still some Italians in the neighborhood, and they all lived in tenements down here. This was one of the biggest tenement districts in the entire world, and there were a lot of problems with this area. But interestingly, so many of our great creators of music, of film, literary world, so many of them come from this area. And so it is that Jack Jack was born here in 1917. I think his parents were first generation that came over from Austria, and they worked. His father had a job, a very, very, very common job in the Lower East Side at this time, where he worked in the garment district. He was a tailor, and then he started working with these big garment companies. This was the heart of the garment world. In fact, if you look at our fashion industry today, which is in Midtown, it's kind of it traces itself back to this area, and so thousands of people were employed, making really. I mean, I do not remember the exact percentage. We actually did a podcast on this, but I want to say it's like almost 10% of clothing in the United States came
Back
from
when people actually like made clothes and
everything
didn't
was
just go buy them.
hand stitched, right? And but that's of manufactured clothing, because back then a lot of people still made their own clothes at home. So anyway, so Jack grew up on the mean streets of the Lower East Side in Suffolk Street, and there's these crowded tenements, so you spent a lot of your life as a kid out on the streets. Or on the rooftops, actually. I read a funny quote of his saying that he actually didn't look very fondly at this time because he was tired of chasing people over rooftops, and he was tired of having people chase him. So
I wonder what that could have inspired.
Right. So, I mean, that is something to keep in mind here, is that because New York is so important to the history of comic books, the DNA of New York City is in comic books. And so, as we'll probably get to later, what Marvel does is sort of kicked it up a notch by literally putting New York City in its comic books, in its origins, and in the sort of, the reason for being for many of these characters. So, Jack flew around the streets and street gangs and all of that. You probably see this influence the most, perhaps not surprisingly, in The Thing, in the character The Thing and the Yancy Street gang, which a lot of people just draw instantly, Delancey, Yancy Street gang. But he pulled a lot of those experiences and put them there on the page. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he was always interested in drawing and in art, and he was not formally trained. He tried to go to the Educational Alliance, which is actually on East Broadway still, and he drew too fast. He was apparently, he's known, right? This is one of his great traits as an artist, is that he was able to rapidly produce things, and was able to get faster and faster, even as his art also got better. So. So grew up in the Lower East Side. What I also think is really interesting is he's about to jump into an industry, the comic book world, that is not well respected in the 1930s, 40s. And so for that reason, a lot of the first great creators are all from the working class. They're almost all men, but there obviously are some good and interesting exceptions. And they're almost all Jewish, which I think it's a very complicated story as to maybe why, and there's not really one reason, although I think one that we can certainly draw is that there's still a lot of anti-Semitism in New York City in the 1930s. And so it just might have been easier if you were just an up-and-coming artist, especially if you weren't trained and you didn't have these lofty academic connections that got you into like an actual magazine, you would get a job because it was pretty easy, and you made a good dime cranking out these comic books. And but it's just funny because the importance that we place upon these first comic books is would have made them snicker back then, because they were just trying to make a buck, and their readers were kids, and they were buying these on the newsstand, and they were probably down at the bottom where all the important magazines and newspapers were up here at your corner newsstand. So. So he began. I don't know how far you want me to keep going.
No, that's
here.
fine. You can. So I was actually kind of bringing it back to like the city itself. You mentioned in your explanation that he grew up on what we would consider today to be a pretty rough situation. Like, you know, you can find stories of Jack Kirby kind of running around the streets and getting in fights and being in street gangs. So how do you, and this is for you, towards you, Tom, or Brandon, when you're writing stories that exist in this sort of fictionalized version, how do you color the city that, you know, New York in the Marvel universe as being sort of multifaceted and not just, because clearly it's not just all mean streets in Marvel today?
I don't know. I mean, it's not something that we have to work at consciously. You know, when Kirby was devising the Marvel universe, his Marvel universe, he drew from his experiences and his childhood and his wartime service, and all the things that he went through are reflected and remixed and drawn upon again and again in all of the stories that he told. So, you know, not only did the early Marvel Universe stories take place in New York City, but in a lot of ways, they didn't take place in a contemporary New York City. They took place in a very stylized New York City that more resembled the New York that Jack remembered rather than the New York that actually existed. These days, our creators don't come from the same background, don't have the same experiences. And so their view of New York is probably a little bit more informed by the actual New York of today, on top of which it's so much easier to get reference now. You have
Cell phone cameras and
you have a whole internet there for almost anything that you want to be able to visualize and draw. To say nothing of, you know, computer programs like SketchUp, where you can actually build whole buildings and whole street models and move them around in 3D. That it's, you know, the need to create whole universes completely from whole cloth out of your head is not as necessary a part of that as it might have been during Kirby's days.
So is there someone at the Marvel office who is kind of like the cartographer of the New York City that exists in Marvel?
Not specifically. I mean, we've had over the years, we've done a number of, as part of the Marvel Universe handbooks and projects like that, we've done kind of maps of, you know, Marvel Universe Manhattan and the surrounding boroughs and such, and where Peter Parker's house is and where Matt Murdock's office is, and you know, I can tell you that the Baxter Building is at Madison and 42nd. You know, because I know that. I could tell you that Avengers Mansion is 890 Fifth Avenue because I know that. You know, and so over the years, as different places, different locations have shown up. Here's where Luke Cage's, Heroes for Hire office was on 42nd Street or whatnot. You know, those have kind of been plugged into, you know, sort of a fictionalized map of Manhattan. But it's not something that, like, every time we're going to create something new, we pull the map out and go, what street have we not done yet? You know, it's a lot more freewheeling than that. People just come up with stories, and then, you know, after the fact, our guys go, okay, that's here.
I can see the Sanctum Sanctorum from my apartment window.
You can find it on Google Maps as well.
Which is pretty cool. Although it's actually not really cool because it's just like a regular old building.
It just looks like a regular old building.
Exactly. There's a concealment
seems
spell.
to be a regular old building.
Exactly.
So, Brandon, when you're working, like, you're coming to Jack from kind of two angles. Like, you have the New York element, and you also have Devil Dinosaur in your book, which is one of Jack's, you know, more otherworldly creations, I think is a pretty generous way to say that. A giant alien dinosaur. And you brought him into the city. How is that balancing act, like these two different creations?
Yeah, we spend very little time in the dinosaur world, right? But it's always fun to spend a few pages there. But a book, something that made it interesting to me, and I think, you know, early on with Amy Reeder and Natasha Bustos, just the idea of kind of bringing it into modern New York made it just a more interesting concept. And you always, you know, whatever you do, if you can make the setting a character in the story, you totally want to take advantage of that. So I live downtown. I live in Greenwich Village. Amy lives in the West Village. She has her studio on Rivington Street on the Lower East Side. So it's like, yeah, we can really take advantage of the neighborhood. We are not going to be putting it in the Valley of Flame, but why don't we make Lunella grow up on Yancy Street, and also play with how much the neighborhood's changed, and we've been able to do that every couple of issues. That it is a really different neighborhood than Ben Grimm grew up in. I don't know exactly in continuity if there's a number of years between them. But, you know, just it's one of
those flexible things that we kind of
of course, right, and that's the game, and the way and when it's my turn to play the game, I do want to make Ben as old as possible and Lunella as young as possible to be a different Yancy Street. And in my mind, Ben always being kind of growing up in the Yancy Street that Kirby would remember. But so many contributors do it. Like I said, I can see Dr. Strange's secret headquarters from my window. The Miller's Hell's Kitchen, which was very much reflective of the 80s, at least the perception of the 80s in New York, and Frank living there. There's such great locations, and you want to keep them, but that's not New York anymore, and it's always a really interesting balance. I mean, you don't have street gangs anymore in Hell's Kitchen for Daredevil to fight. You have condos.
Daredevil has unfortunately,
he succeeded.
He succeeded, and now
He did a
now
great
he's out of a
job.
job.
Thanks, Matt.
Right.
There's a lot of Thai restaurants in Hell's
there
Kitchen.
is. That's right.
Um, So actually,
They're all connected to the hand. It's all
a front.
I know.
Don't believe it. So before the panel, actually, Greg and I were talking a little bit about how there are still some strange echoes of, like, especially the street gangs that Kirby was involved in, and how the sort of organization between the gangs and forming, like, groups of gangs that governed each other, how that still kind of almost exists in a form today. Can you speak to that at all, Greg?
You mean in terms of how it was reflected in the comics?
Yeah,
or?
I mean, historically, or speaking of, like, from the page.
Well, so the street gangs that he was involved with, I mean, a lot of it gets like muddied in recollection, because when these men talk about the gangs they were in, for them it was just like, oh, it was just a bunch of kids kicking a can around or whatever. But then, you also had, at the same time, you had the formation of organized crime was happening all around him. I mean, he was a boy during Prohibition.
Sure. Yeah.
And this was the rise of organized crime in New York, and which was happening around like around him in all of the basements and the alleyways of New York. So this is what he was saying. This is what the kids around him were seeing. This is what they were emulating. Mm-hmm. So, so I mean, I suspect that he and the Suffolk Street Gang did not necessarily go out and commit like a host of crimes. I certainly hope not. But were more of just like what you needed to do to survive is you needed to have your gang, your posse, and I mean, everyone in the gang, your families all may have lived in the same tenements.
Sure.
And again, imagine being a kid in this area. There's like on a hot summer's day, there's no air conditioning. There's like nothing to do. You don't have any money. So I mean, that is, I feel like that is why one of the reasons he turned to art is because it was almost like, if I can't go, I can't go to the movies. I can't buy a newspaper, but I can just create my own.
Sure. So speaking of like turning to art and kind of growing up in less than ideal circumstances, however dire those circumstances might have been, like, Jack seems to have injected his heritage and his time in the city into characters' backstories just as much as he did, like the settings. Like, there's literally a giant bronze statue of Steve Rogers in Prospect Park. As his Brooklyn heritage is so important. Is there a way, kind of creatively, that you manage that heritage, like, on the page and coming through those characters to keep it authentic, I guess, is anyone free for anybody?
I mean, I certainly do, but it's easy because I have a new character who's a product of an approximation of current Lower East Side.
Sure.
So it's without having to kind of reconcile all the years and all the changes and all the creative teams. Maybe that's a little bit easier. But no, you definitely want to have the character informed by the neighborhood, because we have the luxury of doing that, because we have some knowledge and the ability to do it with a new character.
Yeah, and in the case of a character like Captain America, because for all that, the modern Marvel universe spans X number of floating years. His early days, Steve Rogers grew up in circumstances not that different from Jack Kirby's.
Sure.
And so that's always a touch point with that character, because the piece that moves forward isn't when he was born and when he fought in World War II. The piece that moves forward is when he was unfrozen from suspended animation. And so that's always a place that you can kind of go back to with Steve Rogers, with Captain America, maybe more than other characters. It gets a little widgier if you're dealing with Ben Grimm, because even if you assume Ben Grimm is in, I'll say, his 40s, that's still...
You just made that canon.
That's still only, like the 80s at its earliest. And, what you think of as Ben Grimm's New York wasn't around in the 80s. It was very different then.
Sure.
So, you kind of stretch a point and go, well, there's fiction and there's kind of what you want it to be or want it to have been, or it's so ingrained in that character that he kind of came up from circumstances that very much reflected Kirby's own upbringing, that still exists, even though somehow all the streets around Yancy Street weren't at all like that.
Sure.
You wander into that one block, and suddenly you were back in sort of
it's
Depression
a perfect little
era.
time capsule.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And plus it becomes self-referencing, right? Because the comics over the decades, how much they evolve, but you still want to, at least I do, and I'm sure a lot of creators, you still want to kind of reference back to the comics you read and the experience and say, oh, I want that neighborhood to be a little bit like it when I read it. Maybe you read it in the 90s or in the 80s or in the 70s, and it's getting mixed in all kinds of ways, which is a great strength, which is why it's a unique New York. But all starting with Jack Kirby.
Sure. So when you are dealing with this sort of city that's a character, like I don't think we need to even like caveat that, like the city is literally a character in Marvel stories. What do you think is, kind of the most important definition that, a creator like Jack Kirby has given that city that's made it so endearing?
I would even speak even just generally to many of the Marvel properties that he worked on and Stan Lee worked on and many of the others, how up until that point, you'll open a comic book and you may have a cityscape.
Sure.
But, other comic companies they wouldn't say it's in New York. It's just because it doesn't matter. It's just wallpaper. Well, what they decided is that it was going to reflect their lives. And, that comes out in many different ways. It comes out in the storylines, which are a lot more textured and more adult. But they were going to have the thing outside their window. They were going to have that in the comic books. And to me, I feel like that, to me, says something that it's a personal, like what they're putting on the page is a lot more personal than Ergo. And I think why the characters have this sort of urbanness built into them in the 1960s, right? Because, most of these characters that we're talking about,
Sure.
but although Captain America, for an exception we'll talk about, were in 1960s, and New York wasn't so hot in the 1960s and was only getting worse. So that's another interesting creative decision. Also it's it's why we have a Daredevil, for instance, because there was that Hell's Kitchen was a horrible cesspool of crime. You had Doctor Strange in the Village because that's where a bunch of weird trippy stuff was happening in the 1960s, and the same goes for the Fantastic Four. The same goes for all Marvel characters. But Jack, he just built he built all that into their biographies in a way that you can't take it out. You couldn't you couldn't really move the Fantastic Four and put it in Denver. But you could today you probably could because character identities are so much more fleshed out. But back then, things were a lot more sort of iconic, so putting it in New York was also recognizable too.
Sure.
It was also, you talk about it like they made the choice to, which makes it sound like they sat down and had a very deep discussion about
they didn't.
this.
Yeah, it's true.
And that's completely not at all the way it worked, And in fact, the first Fantastic Four story is set in the fictional town of Central City, California.
Yeah, it might have just been easier to
it literally
New York.
was. Right. They were producing these things and they were doing them so quickly and so from the hip that it was just easier to do it there. It was easier for Stan in particular to put everything in New York because he knew New York. He'd have to make things up. He could reflect real things and felt like an audience, even if it was an audience that was reading it in Chicago or in Los Angeles or in Texas or wherever, could relate to those events and they would seem more legitimate, more authentic. than if they were just happening in completely fanciful places. You know, and they kind of tapped into something, but it was a very it was a very instinctive kind of a move, and I don't think it was anything that was in any way or shape planned or even conversed about. They just started doing it, and in fact, it kind of happened as they went along. That again, those very early stories are set in fictional cities.
Right.
And it took them a couple of issues to go, right, we'll put it in
It's just
Manhattan.
easier to
We'll
do
give them a
this,
skyscraper.
right.
That'll be nice.
So when you're talking about how it's like a slow process to kind of set these characters in Manhattan, this was also, I mean, in the golden age of comics, this was the genesis of the concept of a shared universe. So you have, characters who can visit each other now, and characters that have a touchstone. So managing kind of the continuity, and like if there's no real like cartography of or concrete cartography, I guess I should say, of the Marvel universe. What is it like kind of managing the fact that all of these characters can now just visit each other?
Well, again, when Stan did it, he didn't do it, through any sort of master plan. He did it partly because it was easy, and partly because he was a promoter. He was a showman, and the easiest way to promote one character was to have another popular character show up or to make reference to that character in another character's book. And so it was just easier and more convenient to more or less have them all in the same place, except for the Hulk, who for some reason was in the Midwest. But everybody else, they got put in and around Manhattan. Again, almost more as a set of convenience than anything. It also kind of helped that, as was said earlier, particularly up through the 60s until towards the end of the 60s, really, and Kirby was the first major guy to kind of go against this, pretty much if you worked in comics, you lived in and around New York. The business was such that it was a hand-delivered business. There was no Federal Express. There was no digital delivery. If you were going to write and draw a story, you were going to go into an editor's office and get that story, pick it up, go home with your script, draw the pages, bring it back to the office, physically hand it over to the next guy in the production chain, and so forth and so on. It was a necessity that the writers and artists lived locally, and so the fact that these stories were all set locally meant everybody had a common language that they could draw upon.
A shorthand that they could
that was very easy, and that again, it was maybe a little more convincing than a Metropolis or Gotham City, where you maybe had kind of a vague sense of it as a city.
Sure.
But nobody has any idea what the boroughs are in Metropolis, or if it even has them, or where the Daily Planet is located in relation to Clark Kent's apartment or City Hall. Like, these are just, they exist to whatever extent they need to for whatever story there is, and somehow the Marvel stuff was just a little bit more plausible because you understood, oh, that's the West Side, and that's Greenwich Village, and that's Midtown Manhattan, and that's Uptown. And even if you didn't know exactly what street or what block or what everything is, you could go to your map. There are plenty of creators. John Byrne in particular. I remember, the first time he came to New York, when he was first breaking into the business, he would kind of look up. As a kid, he sort of thought maybe it was all real, because it was happening in real cities, and you could look them up on a map, or you could read about them in the newspaper, and you could you kind of look up and go, you kind of expect to see Spider-Man in the sky swinging between the buildings.
Could you lean when you're speaking? Could you lean a little closer to me? Okay.
No, I can't do that.
I just have to, because that story just resonated with me. I mean, so what I do now is a podcast about New York City history. My first experience in my life, because I'm not from New York, I'm from Missouri, and so the Southwest Missouri, which is about as far away from New York, like spiritually, if not actually physically on the map, but pretty damn far away. My first thing I ever saw of New York City was a Fantastic Four comic book, or like rather a stack of Marvel comic books. Do you remember where you can they were like in a little plastic bag, and you could get like 3 of them, and it was so good. Those were my first experience with New York, and it was a real place. Like, it wasn't. I would then branch out to other comic books where the city was just like some squiggly lines in the background. It wasn't geotagged to an actual place.
Sure.
It was still one step closer to home, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, Alan Davis, who lives, who was an artist who lives in the United Kingdom, talks about that again as a kid. He would read these imported Marvel comics or translated or domesticated Marvel comics, and that was his impression as to what New York and what America was actually like. And so it was perhaps a little disappointing the first time he came over and saw it wasn't quite as jam-packed and colorful and explosive as it might have been in a Jack Kirby page. But that was, it had an extra layer of realism and relevancy to it simply because it was a reflection of a real place.
Sure. So again, before the panel, we were talking a little. Greg and I were speaking a bit about that realism and how the headquarters of Marvel would actually kind of get threats when Kirby was working there, and how those sort of built into his mythology as a creator and as a person.
Yeah. So there's a story, Captain America #1. This was his first appearance, I believe.
Yes.
This was his very first appearance. Captain America #1, cover of the comic book has Captain America punching a Nazi, punching Adolf Hitler, actually, punching Adolf Hitler in the face. So, but this was, I think it came out December 1939, was dated
December 1940.
40 came out early 41.
December 22nd.
Oh, good job.
1940.
Oh, that's a good job. That is like, okay.
These are things I know.
But so America wasn't in the war yet. We were about to, but they were, and this was Timely Comics. This wasn't Marvel back then, and it was Jack Kirby, Joe Simon, and Martin Goodman was the owner of Timely.
Yes,
anyway,
the owner and publisher.
They were all Jewish men. And here they were producing a comic book where Adolf Hitler was being punched in the face. They got death threats in the office, and it was very, very kind of touch and go because there were a lot of pro-German sympathizers at this particular time. I mean, it was also like, it was just like this precarious world in New York of like, were we going to war? It just seemed inevitable. Everyone was super tense. It got so bad that actually Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia actually called them and reassured them that they would be taken care of. I believe they had police officers who then watched the building. They were at the McGraw-Hill building on 42nd Street, if anyone knows where that is, in Times Square. So, yeah, I mean, and that is right out of the box for him. I mean, he has, like, an amazing adventure ahead of him of all these wonderful things he's about to create over the next 40 years, right? So this is how he starts, pretty much. So, pretty gutsy.
So I think we have time to open it up for, is there a mic? We can open it up for audience questions, or I think it's right over there. Or we can totally just keep talking. That's totally fine. Oh, perfect.
Just curious, I'm a little, and I'm sorry, I'm a Marvel noob, so forgive me.
Yep.
I want to know.
Jack Kirby was an artist. He used to work for us. all the stuff you like, he created it. He's yeah, okay.
I was at D23 when they gave him his Disney Legend Award.
Very nice.
Oh,
Very nice.
Awesome.
What I wanted to know is what was the inspiration for the Xavier Institute? So.
Ooh.
That's a I don't know about the institute proper. I know Kirby read a lot of pulp magazines, pulp science fiction, and he read a lot of like scientific magazines. And there's a lot of talk, in the 50s and 60s about genetic mutations and the effect radiation will have on people and how they'll evolve and so forth. And so, the notion of doing a superhero book that's about that, it's kind of, particularly if you look at just the Kirby drawn issues of the early X-Men, not the stuff that came later and whatnot, it's very much one of the forerunners of one of the themes that Kirby would come back to a number of times in his life, which is the hidden race, the hidden society, the people that live among us who look like us but are a little different. The Inhumans is that. The New Gods is that. The Eternals is that. It's always there's good and there are good ones and bad ones, and they all exist among us and are fighting out this secret war, in our midst. And mutants was kind of the first stab at that, or an early progenitor of that idea in his mind. Sort of represented by Professor X and Magneto and the X-Men and the Brotherhood as kind of the two warring halves of that same sort of an equation. But that all kind of grew out of the pulp fiction of the time and the scientific theory or quasi-theory of the time. I don't know specifically about the mansion itself. I'm sure
Up in Westchester.
if you researched it, there's
yeah.
probably a building that's exactly that building somewhere.
You know,
but-
and maybe it's still this way. During the when one of the X-Men movies came out, you could actually go to Google Maps and it showed where where it was, even though of course it wasn't there. I don't know how you guys swung that, but that is awesome.
Yeah.
I just love that.
Oh. Yep. Go ahead.
Now that New York has been so heavily gentrified and there's a Starbucks on every single corner, how much harder is it to make New York City a character now as opposed to back in Kirby's day?
I'm going to repeat the question so anyone, if
Okay.
people didn't hear. He's asking, now that New York is so gentrified, with their like Starbucks on every corner, is it more difficult? And correct me if I'm wrong. Is it more difficult to create New York as a character today than it would have been back in the early days of Marvel? Is that okay?
Yeah, I don't think so, because it's not, you're not going outside with a camera, right? You can do whatever you want, and the Marvel universe and Marvel's New York has become its own thing. And if you want to actually tell a story that's maybe about gentrification or a bit interesting twist on it, you can put that in. You want to talk about street gangs running wild in Hell's Kitchen, you can still do it. There's the entire history of New York, but there's also the entire Marvel visual history of New York also that you can just always pull from. And we're working on, I don't even know what Marvel's putting up, but if it's 50 books a month, if it's and how many other creative teams in a year are working on a book over how many years, it's if you sit and try to add it all up and you try to draw the map on a piece of graph paper, you're going to start doubling up and having big gaps in it. But as long as you're just kind of rock and rolling it, you can take whatever you want. And to me, it's an advantage. You can take all the eras because they've always existed in the Marvel universe. Like I said, for as long as there's been a Marvel New York, there have been all these different aspects from almost any time. So they're all kind of still there.
Yeah, it has to feel authentic, but it doesn't have to
The illusion
be
of
authentic,
authentic, yeah,
if that
exactly.
makes sense. That in some ways, the Marvel Universe New York, solely by the fact that 500 superheroes and villains live there, is right there very different from the New York we live in, where only 20 or 30 supervillains
There we go.
actually live, and that means we can mix and match as we want to, because it's fiction. We make it up, and as long as it feels legitimate and there's a certain commonality of if Spider-Man goes to Hell's Kitchen, it's not markedly different than the place that Daredevil goes or that Iron Man goes or whomever. It has a verisimilitude that feels real, even though the real Hell's Kitchen is a very nice place now.
Wasn't there? There's a recent issue of Ms. Marvel where the gentrification was actually
Yes.
a villain. Someone was actually trying to gentrify it with had a villain attached to it. I mean, they got it. It's like whatever the city will throw at them, I'm sure they'll be able to adjust. So.
You on the end here? Yeah. Mhm.
Hi. It's interesting that the conversation started around to race and gentrification because as a young kid in New York City, I grew up with Marvel Comics. And specifically Jack Kirby, his stories and about New York really rang a personal note, with me. And I wondered if you might talk about the influence of race and Judaism, because in 2017 it's not just the 100th anniversary of Jack's birth, but also of Will Eisner, another, one of my heroes. And it was, these kind of influences that helped me form my own comic book character as an Asian American growing up in New York. So specifically my question is directed towards the disenfranchisement towards Jewish kids in the ghetto in New York City and at the turn of the century. And I wonder if you see any correlation between the new breed of comic book artists that are Asian American, maybe feeling a little outside of the New York or American scene.
Well, I think you have a couple of questions in there. I'm going to try and answer as many parts of them as I can, and kind of like skirt past all the ones that I can't answer. But going back to Kirby's roots and the same sort of commonality that spawned Will Eisner and spawned a lot of the early comic book writers and artists, including people that are not really well known anymore. Kirby would talk about how his family had a very strong oral tradition of storytelling. That was very much a thing in Jewish communities, that they would get together and they would tell stories of the old country, and whether those were myths or family stories or legends or whatnots. The spinning of a yarn was something that was very much woven into the fabric of a lot of Jewish immigrants of that period. And so Kirby kind of, he said like he got all of his storytelling skills from his mom, and to a lesser degree from his grandmother, who would tell these stories. And so what he was doing was very much an extension of that. I think that Will Eisner had similar notes in his background, not exactly the same, but there was a very strong tradition of the storyteller within that community. Also, again, as was said earlier, if you were a Jewish immigrant in the 20s and 30s, you had a hard time getting a job because there was a lot of rampant anti-Semitism. And while comic books represented kind of a bargain basement place to go to get a gig, it was a place where you could earn money at a time when people were pretty desperate for any sort of job. Kirby, when he was producing pages, and working on the earliest Captain America stories and the stuff he did before that, he was making good money for the time for his community. Not necessarily great in the scope of the world. He wasn't a millionaire, but he was very quickly bringing in more money than his dad, and supporting the rest of the family, his mom and his pop, and that was a thing that somebody who had the skill and the drive could do and could become successful at it. It's part of the reason that guys like Will went into that, and certainly that need to put bread on the table was always a huge motivating factor for Kirby throughout his entire life, all the way to the end. That was the thing more than anything else. That
A lot of similar traits to the South Asian community.
Certainly. Again, I don't know enough about the world. Is the truths of the world remain the same, but the world changes. I don't know that I'm have a good enough understanding and background of what somebody in that situation today is going through and dealing with. It certainly helps that the world is smaller, that Marvel now has artists and creators who work around the globe. And as long as people can produce art at a certain level of craft and deliver it in a timely fashion, they can be people that are contributing to Marvel and contributing to what we do. And so in a sense, if you are a disenfranchised person living somewhere else who can get access to at least enough technology to be able to, send us pages, through the internet, and are driven to produce, like Kirby, you potentially, can better your situation and make the most of the talents that you've been given.
American dream.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. But again, I don't know enough culturally to really speak to any of that. I'm an old white dude. There's nothing I can do about that.
Down in the end, yeah.
Hi. First, I just wanted to say thank you for telling Kirby's story and continuing that legacy, because for people who share his background and his upbringing, it's very inspiring. And when you were talking, I was just thinking about The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, and so I guess my question is, like, the role of comic books as like a snapshot of the reality versus an opportunity for escape. Like, how has that changed over time, and how would Kirby kind of see the role of comic books on that spectrum?
I'll repeat the question just in case anyone didn't hear it. She's asking how the evolution of comics from like a reflection of reality to a form of escapism has changed over time, and how Kirby would probably see it now looking back. Is that correct? Or? Yeah. Okay.
Well, certainly, and I don't want to monopolize, so if anybody has stuff, feel free to just stop me. I think certainly comic books today, and what we now call very pretentiously sometimes graphic novels and graphic fiction, has reached a much greater level of acceptance, particularly over the last 20, 25 years. And even the type of story, the type of subject matter, the way the story is told, is has a much greater range than there was at any point during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when Jack was doing, even the 70s, when Jack was doing most of the work that he had done. These are all things that Kirby kind of predicted. Kirby was talking about the idea that, all the stories that he was doing were the blueprints for movies, and that he wanted to do larger stories that would be released in bookstores and collected and be in print forever. And, the sort of very short-term thinking people who ran a lot of the publishing outfits at that time, including Marvel, thought he was nuts. This was a turnkey product. You put one out, somebody read it, they bought it for 12 cents, 15 cents, and if they liked it, maybe the next month they bought another one, or maybe if your cover was really exciting, the next month they bought that one. But the idea that there was any lasting merit or any lasting value in this was very alien to a lot of the people who ran these companies. They were selling paper. They were not selling stories. They literally were just selling paper. So I think Kirby, would not be surprised at the world we have today and the fact that there are, multi-million-dollar motion pictures based on these kinds of characters and stories, and the fact that the opportunities for somebody doing comics have grown so wildly and so exponentially. That having been said, anytime people would ask him, during his lifetime, about his philosophy towards the work or the things that it was all about, he would always come back very simply to, I sell the book. That's what I do. I tell my stories and I tell them as truthfully as I can, and I make you believe in them, and I sell the book and you buy the book, and that's what I do. He was a very, I think, instinctive artist. He was absolutely a guy that thought on a different level and in a different way than anybody else. But I also don't think he analyzed a hell of a lot of it. A lot of what he did was very instinctive and very much from his brain through his arm to the page, in a way that he didn't over analyze it that much. It was true to him. It was emotionally true to him, whatever he was doing, whatever he was getting at, whatever metaphor he was crafting and creating these stories of heroes and villains and gods and monsters and whatnot. There was a veracity to them that was true for him, and as long as that was the case, he felt it would work on the page. So today, I'm sure he would take advantage of all the tools that we have now, the photoshops of the things, and all the digital stuff that was there. In the way he used to do collages and make collages of cut paper part of comic book pages, and they would reproduce terribly because nobody wanted to pay to reproduce them properly. These days he'd do that all digitally. But I don't know that his outlook would be any different. I'm going to tell great stories, and I'm going to tell stories that are true and are human, and I'm going to sell the book.
Mm-hmm. You're right, sir.
I was wondering, with respect to Jack Kirby used to produce an enormous amount of work each month, sometimes 4, sometimes 5 books at a time. Given that workload, would he prioritize one title over another, or was it purely a volume business in that day?
Well, it was a little of both. It was certainly a volume business, but some of that was you weren't really making a lot of money per page or per issue, so you had to produce a lot. When I talked earlier about the fact that Kirby was motivated by putting bread on the table for the family, particularly by the end of the middle and end of the 60s, the Kirby family didn't live badly. They lived a very nice, solid, middle income family existence. His daughter had a horse at one point. They had a swimming pool
dream.
when they moved to California. But the thing that allowed them to do all of that was that Jack would go down to the basement studio that they called the dungeon and work for 14 or 15 hours. He would sit there with the TV or the radio on in the background to give him noise and escape into his own head and just go all night. And every once in a while, his wife Roz would have to like come down, and he'd never come to bed, and pull him away from the drawing board and go, Kirby, come to bed. You got to sleep. And part of that was these worlds, these things that were in his head and in his soul, he liked to explore and how to get out, and he would kind of get lost in them. It's a commonly told anecdote that they would, like Kirby, it wasn't that he could not drive a car, it's that you could not let him drive a car because he would start to daydream about something, and the next thing you knew, you'd be up on the curb. So, his wife or, the many guys that assisted him over the years, Mark Evanier and Steve Sherman and guys like that, would always be the ones driving because, Jack would just get lost in his own enormous, immense thoughts. But in terms of the actual production, you'd be on 3 books at a given time or 4 books, and it was always either whichever one is most immediately due, or if you were in good shape on any of them, whatever, wherever the muse sort of struck you and took you. The amazing thing about that is that not just that Kirby did that much work, but that he did other stuff as well that you don't even think about. He did enormous drawings for himself, and he innovated characters. All the New Gods characters were created while he was working on Marvel stuff. He had these enormous presentation boards that he stockpiled, and he would do those collages, which had to take hours, that he would do for fun and then find ways to incorporate into the books he was doing. So he was a real early workaholic.
All the way in the back, you with the red hair, yeah. So the question, if I could, I'm sorry, it was really hard to hear. Did the political climate of the 50s and 60s, sure, like New York City politics in the 50s and 60s, do you think they're reflected in Kirby's work? Reflected in Kirby's work, or?
I can't speak to anything specifically off the top of my head that's Jack Kirby, but I just think Marvel as a general rule in the early years reflected reflected the things that were happening on the street. I remember, I think the oldest comic book I own in my collection is this Spider-Man issue where he's dealing with there's a heroin situation in Greenwich Village, and it's just that is so adult and sophisticated compared to everything else on the newsstand or the little swirly thing where you get your comic books.
Spinner rack.
And so I think it was maybe not, unless someone can come up with a specific example, maybe not reflecting the actual politics of the city until the 70s. Marvel would get into that, I think, very specifically in the 70s and 80s. But perhaps in the 60s, it was more the sort of cultural things that were happening on the street that were probably more important. So yeah, probably, kind of.
A little bit of both. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
I just wanted to know, did you get a chance to create a comic book with Jack Kirby once again?
I never created a comic with Jack. I met him 2 or 3 times, and when I was a very young editor many years ago, I edited and put together a collection of Boys Ranch, which was a strip that he and Joe Simon did in the 1950s, well-regarded strip. And Jack wrote an introduction for that, which was the only thing he ever actually did for me. It was writing, and it was an introduction, and that was the only thing. By the time I was in the business, he was more or less out.
In the back again, yeah. Yep. So the question was talking about Kirby's heritage as a Jewish person, how Marvel is currently maintaining that, like, the integrity of that heritage and modernizing it while other voices are adding to that conversation. Is that about a good summation of that question? Okay.
I think as a writer, it's always assumed that you put a bit of yourself into the writing, but you go through 10 different projects. So is each one a 10th? Is each one a piece of yourself? You start always pulling on other people. Sometimes it's the opposite of what you would do in a situation, and at least for me. There's a lot of writers out there who kind of will go through the motions of a character and say, I need to know their middle name, I need to know what they would do in this situation or in that situation. For me personally, it's always just been kind of leaving it open to interpretation. And of course, what's existed before from all the characters, if you're working on a character that's a big Marvel or DC character, that's going to be there. A little bit of yourself is going to be there. But I always try to also keep it vague enough or enough room that the reader's experience is also going to fit into it. Because there's a lot of universal truths, obviously, for lack of a less subtle word. But it's, more subtle word. But yeah, you want to kind of keep it so that they're always identifiable, but also unique. It's just a balancing act. I'm kind of babbling now. But I guess my point is that as much as you put a little bit of yourself in, as much as you preserve what's there before, at least in my mind, you always want the reader to also be able to put some of themselves into it. And that's something of an art that's never going to be perfect, but you kind of leave room and opportunity. You even do it for the artists that you're working with, right? That they're going to have to put in some of the acting and the storytelling. It's not just to forward the plot, but so much of the emotion is going to be into it also. So yeah, I just try to keep it flexible.
Yeah, we're today in modern comics, not only are they more sophisticated, but they're more inclusive than they've ever been before. Certainly, whether it was the common wisdom of the time or the prejudice of the time, the same sort of worries about non-WASP anti-Semitism or general bigotries. The reason that Jacob Kurtzberg adopted the name Jack Kirby, and that's it's not like those problems haven't gone away, but the permissiveness in the world of comics has gotten greater. Years ago, now 15 or 16 years ago, when I was editing Fantastic Four, I edited the story in which we, and I'm going to put it in air quotes, revealed that Ben Grimm was Jewish, and this wasn't done by us as any great revelation. Carl Kiesel wrote the issue. It in fact was one of a 2-issue fill-in, but just the fact that we stated it in a comic book got so much attention and got so much press and pickup because it had just never been outwardly stated before. Because this was just not an area that most comic book characters got into. If you understood that the thing was Jewish, you understood it based on contextual clues in the stories. The way he spoke, the kind of things he did, and the way he conducted himself, and the fact that the creators who had originated him were themselves, Jewish. But it was, it was seen as maybe it was dicey in those days to say it because there were people who wouldn't like it, in the same sort of way that it was dicey to have, a black superhero until 1966. And even then, it's not like there were immediately a flood of them. It was a slow process. You got the Black Panther in 1966, and you got the Falcon by 1969 or so. And at DC, you didn't get a black superhero really until around 1976.
I'm sorry to cut you off a little bit. I just got the word
Okay.
out of time notice from our panel. So thank you so much for coming in and hearing us speak. Thank you for your interest. And have a great rest of the con.
Yes.